Geotechnical surveys. They're pretty complicated, and a lot of clients sometimes get a little bit stuck when requesting them. So the purpose of this video is to help break it down and help to advise how we would recommend the best practice process. So first of all, what is a geotechnical survey and why is it required? What it is essentially testing the ground conditions on a specific site in order to know the strength of the soil, so that the engineers in the future can design the right foundation type. So if you know how strong the load-bearing capacity is of the soil, you can then decide what kind of foundations you need: strip foundations, pile foundations, whatever it might be. How it works is essentially a team go onto the site with machinery and they put these big piles into the ground, tubular piles into the ground. It essentially extracts the soil, and then on that soil tube, you then take a frequency of samples, and that gets sent to the lab for testing. So that's essentially how it works. Getting quotes from surveyors is quite a complex process. What we see from the sector, speaking to our surveyors, speaking to clients, how it typically happens is a client will come to them and say, "Hi, I need a quote for geotechnical surveys on this site," and then that individual surveyor will have a look at the site and they'll decide potentially what the scope should be, how many boreholes, how deep each borehole should be, and all that sort of information. The problem is that every surveyor will have their own view, and then when you get the quotes back, you can't really compare apples with apples, because one surveyor recommended 7 boreholes and the other one recommended 13 boreholes at different depths. So what we would recommend is defining the scope early before you go out to surveyors. And what this means is you need to know how many boreholes you need on that specific site, how deep each borehole should be, and if you've got it, a borehole location plan, so you can say this is where we want all the boreholes to be. That's really, really important. And then the final thing is the frequency of the testing. So if you take, let's say, a 5-meter borehole, if you have 1 meter frequency, then you're taking 5 samples of that 5 meters into the lab. So you need to decide these things before you go out to surveyors. Other things to consider when doing a geotechnical survey is that it's very closely entwined with contamination, with land contamination surveys. So what we would always suggest is actually it's best to do a geotechnical survey at the same time you do the land contamination phase 2 survey, because then the same samples that you've taken can be sent to the lab and they can do testing for geotechnical and also the testing for the land contamination. So you don't need to send people to site twice, get the machinery there, do the boreholes twice. It saves a lot of money. So we really recommend you do it at the same time. In order to do that, what you would need to do is you need to do the land contamination phase 1, which is a desktop analysis. And that surveyor will recommend if there is potential contaminants on the site. If there isn't potential contaminants, then you're fine. You don't need to do land contamination phase 2. But if there is contaminants, then you will need a land contamination phase 2, and that's when you should do it at the same time as your geotechnical survey. Don't do them separately. You'll spend way too much money. Do it together and you save a lot. So that's really recommended. For the land contamination aspect of this, we now need more information for the scope. So we also need the frequency again. So at what frequency do you want the samples to be taken? It might be different to the geotechnical frequency, so you need to decide on that. And also, is gas and groundwater monitoring wells required? So what this is essentially, imagine there's a hole in the ground that you've taken your sample from. They then put a monitoring well on the top of it, and that monitors the gas that's removed coming out from the site and also groundwater. So do you need those? How many monitoring wells do you need? All of that's important in order for the surveyors to price. Final thing to consider is something that doesn't have much to do with geotechnical or land contamination, but it's really a good idea to do at the same time. And this is trial pits. And what I mean by trial pits is essentially imagine a kind of a cube that's dug into the ground and it gets filled with water, and the surveyors can then time and see how fast that water takes to filtrate through the soil. The reason that's really important is because it gives you a filtration rate of the soil on the site, which helps the design team and the engineers later on to calculate the sustainable drainage strategy on that specific site. So how will the water flow? It's best to do this at the same time that you're doing geotechnical, as you've got most of the team already there. So they're the specialists that can do this type of work. And we would always recommend, if you need to get your SUDS strategy done, your sustainable drainage strategy done, then make sure you do the trial pits. So in order to define that, we would need to know how many trial pits you would need across your site. So that's something you would have to define. So coming back to kind of summarize this video, in essence, the best practice process when you're going to do geotechnical surveys is to firstly consider land contamination. Do you need to do a land contamination phase 1 report first, which is relatively quick and cheap? Get that done. We always recommend desktop, get it done quickly. That will tell you if there's contamination risks. Then you know that your geotechnical can either be done with or without the land contamination phase 2. So when you go out to surveyors, you can include it into that same scope. You'll save a lot of money, so really, really recommended. And then also, once you've got them together and you decide if you need trial pits, you've then got a list of items that you need to define that scope. So these, just to reiterate them again, how many boreholes you need, how deep each borehole should be, the borehole location plan, the frequency of testing for geotechnical, the frequency of testing for land contamination. Do you need ground and gas monitoring wells? If so, how many? And do you need trial pits? If so, how many? Define all of that. The best way to do that, we always recommend, is with your own consulting team. So if you've got your engineers on board, they should be advising you on this. Alternatively, if you don't have that, come to RenKap. We'll support you. Our surveyors can advise what that scope should be, and then we'll get all the quotes for you on the same scope of service, so you don't have to get loads of mismatched quotes. So yeah, that's how you should be doing geotechnical.